The first thing you should know about Mabel Thorne is that she shot a wolf at 80 yards in a north wind on the morning of January the 11th, 1889. And she did it with one hand on the rifle and the other hand braced against the corner post of her front gate because the wind was strong enough that day to make a grown man stagger. The wolf had been circling her cattle for 3 nights. She knew this because she had been watching from her kitchen window with the lamp turned low the way her husband Silas had taught her to watch before the fever took him in the spring of '87. On the third night, she stopped watching and started waiting. She rose before dawn, put on Silas's heavy coat, which still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and of him, and walked out into the gray light with the rifle across her arms. She did not have to wait long. The wolf came around the south edge of the pasture exactly where she had thought he would. She let him come closer. She let him get into the shallow place where the wind would not turn the bullet. Then she breathed out the way Silas had taught her, slow and even, and she squeezed. The wolf dropped without sound. She stood there a long moment, looking at the small, dark shape against the snow, and she did not feel triumph. She felt only the steady weight of a thing done that had needed doing. Then she walked back to the house, hung the rifle above the door, and put the coffee on. There are women on the high plains of Wyoming territory who have to learn how to pull a trigger before they learn how to cry. Mabel Thorne was one of them. By that morning in January of 1889, she had already shot 2 coyotes, butchered a steer with her own knife, and buried a husband on a windy hillside without weeping, where the children could see. The town of Hollow Creek, a full day's ride to the south, had a name for women like her. The name was not always kind, but it was always spoken with a certain lowering of the voice, the way you speak when you are not entirely sure if the person you are discussing might be just outside the door. Behind her, on a small rise above the cattle pasture, stood the old grain silo. It was a tall, narrow building of weathered gray planking, abandoned 5 years before by the previous homesteader, who had gone bankrupt and walked away. The silo sat where the slope hid it from the main road. You could ride past the Thorne place on the way to Hollow Creek and never know the silo was there at all. That had mattered to Mabel when she made her decision in the late summer of 1888. It mattered very much. Beneath that silo by the morning she shot the wolf, she had already dug something that the people of Hollow Creek were certain meant she had lost her mind. To understand how she came to be digging, you have to understand the summer that came before. Mabel and Silas Thorne had come out from Ohio in the spring of 1883 with 2 small children, a wagon full of seed and tools, and a deed to 160 acres of high plain that the land office in Cheyenne had described with the dry humor common to land office clerks as suitable for cattle if the cattle were patient and the family was patient and the Lord was patient. They built a small log house. They raised a herd. Silas taught Mabel to shoot in the 2nd year because he had to ride into town often, and he would not leave her without a way to defend the children. By 1887, Mabel could put a bullet through a paint can at 60 yards, and Silas was dead. The fever came in March. It moved through him in 11 days. On the last day, he held her hand and tried to tell her something about the cattle and the south fence line, and he could not finish the sentence. He was 37 years old when she buried him. She was 32. The children were Hattie, who was 10 when her father died, and Owen, who was 7. By the summer of 1888, when this story truly begins, Hattie had grown into a tall, serious 12-year-old with her father's brown eyes and her mother's habit of finishing a job once she had started it. Owen was 9 and small for his age and quiet in the way of children who have learned early that their mother carries a great deal and that adding to the weight is a thing not to do. The 4th member of the household, in a sense, was Silas's rifle. It hung above the door, Mabel cleaned it every Sunday morning the way another woman might polish silver. That was the family, that was the place. On a hot afternoon in the second week of July of 1888, a man named Wendell Pike rode up the wagon track to the Thorne homestead, and he did not ride alone. Wendell Pike was the president of the small bank in Hollow Creek. He was 50 years old, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a black town coat that was too heavy for the weather. He had the kind of face that smiled with the mouth, but not with the eyes. Behind him on a sorrel gelding rode Marshall Holloway, the law in Hollow Creek, a heavy-set man of 48 with a gray mustache and the slow, careful eyes of a man who had seen too many bad things to be surprised by any new one. Mabel was on the porch when they came. She had been peeling potatoes for supper. She set the bowl down and stood up and watched them ride into her yard, and she did not go to meet them. She made them dismount and walk to her. Pike removed his hat. The marshal did not. "There was a debt," Pike said. He spoke the way he always spoke when he came calling about a debt, which was the careful, even tone of a man explaining a small piece of unpleasantness that could still, with cooperation, be made small. Silas had borrowed against the homestead in 1885 to buy his second small herd. The note had been renewed in 1886. After Silas passed, Pike had been patient. He had been more than patient. But the bank's directors were asking questions. The current balance was $150 due by Thanksgiving. And if Mabel could not raise it well, the bank had a buyer ready, the Boddicker brother who ran cattle west of her. They would pay enough to clear the note and leave her with a small sum for relocation. It was, Pike said, the only sensible thing. Mabel listened to all of this without interrupting. Marshal Holloway stood 3 paces behind Pike, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, looking off toward the silo with no expression at all. When Pike was finished, Mabel said only, "I will have your $150 by Thanksgiving, Mr. Pike. Go on home." Pike's mouth did the smile thing again. He suggested in the gentle voice of a man who has already calculated the answer that perhaps she should consider the offer more seriously. A woman alone with 2 children on land like this going into a winter, like the one the old-timers were saying was coming. There was no shame, Pike said, in choosing safety. Mabel said, "There is no shame in your offer, Mr. Pike. There is also no agreement. Good afternoon." Pike put his hat back on. He mounted his horse. He turned and rode out of the yard. But Marshal Holloway did not mount. He stayed where he was for another moment. He looked at Mabel, and then he looked past her at the silo on the rise, and then he looked at her again. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice low and grainy, "I do not know what you had got in mind with that old silo up there. I have heard some talk. I do not put much stock in talk. But I will tell you this. If anything happens to those children of yours this winter, anything at all, the law will be asking me first what I knew and when I knew it. You understand what I am saying to you?" "I understand," Mabel said. Marshal Holloway nodded once. He mounted his horse. He rode after Pike without looking back. Mabel stood on her porch and watched the 2 of them go until they were small, dark shapes against the long brown summer of the plains. Then she picked up her bowl of potatoes and went back inside. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and she counted what she had. $47 in a tin box, 18 head of cattle, 6 of them old, a few bolts of cloth, a silver hairpin that had belonged to her mother. She counted these things twice. Then she put them away, and she sat at the table in the dark, and she thought about the silo on the rise, and the things she had been considering for almost a year now, the things she had not said aloud to anyone. She had been thinking about the ground. She had noticed it in her first winter on the plains, and she had been noticing it every winter since. The cattle, when a hard storm came in, did not press themselves against the walls of a barn. They moved toward the middle. They bunched together over the trampled dirt floor in the center of the building. And when she went out to tend them on the worst mornings, the air down there in the middle, low to the ground where the animals stood, was not the same air that lived up by the rafters and out by the walls. It was not warm. She would never have called it warm. But it was not the killing cold either. It was something in between, something that did not change as wildly as the air above ground did. She remembered also the time she had helped Silas dig a fence post hole in February of 1886. 3 feet down the soil was cold, but it was a different cold. It was bearable. It was almost patient. She had no scientific word for what she was thinking. She had only her hands and her eyes and the memory of how the post hole had felt different from the wind that day. She had only the kind of clarity that comes to a person who has to survive and has been paying attention. What if you put a room down there? That was the thought. It was the entire thought. She did not write it down. She did not draw a plan. She just sat with it in the dark of her kitchen on the night of the 11th of July of 1888. And she let it grow in her the way an idea grows in a practical person, slow and quiet and almost without permission. She told no one for 2 weeks. Then she told the children. She told them at breakfast in the matter-of-fact way she told them most things. She said she was going to dig a room beneath the old silo on the rise. She said she did not know yet exactly how big it would be or exactly how deep, but it was going to be a place where the family and the smallest animals could ride out the worst of the winter. She said it had to be a secret. They were not to speak of it to anyone in Hollow Creek, not the schoolmaster, not the children of the Renfrew family, not the storekeeper, no one. She said this not because the thing was wrong, but because there were people in the valley who would prefer she fell. Hattie listened with her brown eyes steady on her mother. When Mabel finished, Hattie said only, "When do we start?" Owen, who was 9 and small, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We will need a way to get the dirt out without anybody seeing where it came from." That was when Mabel knew it would work. The next morning, she took Owen out to the pasture before breakfast, and she put Silas's old, smaller rifle into his hands, and she began to teach him to shoot. He was small, and the kick of the rifle was hard for him, but he was steady. He was already learning to be steady. He fired 6 rounds at a tin she had set on a fence post, and on the 5th he hit it. He looked up at her, and she did not smile because Silas had never smiled when he was teaching her either. She just nodded the way Silas had nodded. Owen nodded back. On their way back to the house, she stopped on the rise and turned him to face the silo. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Mama is thinking about something," she said. "The thing has to stay between us. Can you carry a secret?" "Yes," he said. "That is all you ever have to say," she said. She walked him back to the kitchen. On the 2nd Sunday of August, she dressed the children in their good clothes, and she rode the wagon into Hollow Creek to attend the morning service at the little white frame church on the east end of town. Reverend Josiah Crane was the minister there. He was 45 years old, tall and thin, with the sharp eyes and the strong voice of a man who had spent 15 years convincing himself that the things he believed were the things God believed. He had buried Silas in the spring of '87. Mabel had not always liked him, but she had gone to his church because that is what you did on the high plains. You went to church. You held a place in the community. You let the community see your face. That Sunday, Reverend Crane preached about pride. He preached about the kind of woman who does not submit. He preached about going down into the ground like a creature of the earth instead of looking up to the heavens where the Lord lived. He did not say Mabel's name. He did not have to. Halfway through the sermon, every head in the congregation had turned one at a time to see her sitting in the 3rd pew with her 2 children on either side of her back straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Hattie was holding her mother's sleeve so hard, her knuckles had gone white. Mabel let the sermon run for another minute. Then she stood up. The church went silent. Reverend Crane stopped in the middle of a sentence. Reverend Mabel said, her voice carrying easily in the small room, "If the Lord is unhappy with me, the Lord is welcome to come and speak to me himself. He does not need to send you." She took Hattie's hand. She took Owen's hand. She walked her two children out of the church. She did not look back. She did not have to. She could feel the eyes of every neighbor she had on her back as she walked. She climbed into her wagon. She drove home, and that afternoon she changed out of her good dress and put on her work clothes, and she walked up the rise to the old silo with a pickaxe over her shoulder. She pulled up 4 of the heavy planks of the silo floor in the center of the building where the old grain bins had once stood. She set the planks aside carefully. Then she swung the pickaxe. The first stroke broke the hard, packed surface. The second stroke went deeper. By the time the sun set, she had dug a hole the size of a wash basin. The next day, she dug for 6 hours. Hattie hauled the dirt out in a wooden bucket on a rope and dumped it behind a small scrub hill where it would not be seen from any road. Owen, on the weekends when there was no school, watched the walls of the deepening hole and noticed when they began to go crooked. He had a gift for noticing. The work went slowly. By the second week of September, the hole was deep enough for Mabel to stand in up to her shoulders. By the end of September, she had to use a short ladder to climb out. Other people noticed. There was no way they could not. The first to come was Hank Boddicker and his younger brother Cyrus. They ran cattle on the flatland 4 miles west of the Thorne place. There were originally 4 Boddicker brothers, but 2 had drifted off. And the 2 who remained, Hank at 38 and Cyrus at 30, had a reputation in Hollow Creek for 2 things, which were whiskey and the loud kind of opinion that comes after whiskey. They rode in on a yellow afternoon in the second week of September. Hank stayed on his horse. He was the older one, the careful one. Cyrus dismounted. Cyrus had a way of standing too close. Mabel was in the yard splitting kindling. She did not stop. She kept the axe in her hand. Hank made the offer, $280 for the homestead. It would clear the bank note. It would leave her enough to take the train back to Ohio. He said the words "back to Ohio" as if Ohio were a kindness he was offering her. Mabel said no. Cyrus stepped a little closer. He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on him at 10 in the morning. He looked over toward the silo on the rise. He smiled with his teeth. "You know what is dangerous, Mrs. Thorne," he said. "A woman by herself on the high plains. Things happen. People fall. Children get sick. A fire starts in a barn and nobody is there to put it out in time. Things happen out here. You ought to think about that." She set the axe down. She bent and picked up the rifle that had been leaning against the chopping block, which she had put there that morning, because she did not like the look of the dust the Boddicker horses had thrown coming up her track. She did not raise the rifle. She held it across her body the way Silas had taught her to hold it when she wanted a man to understand without needing to be told. "I know what is dangerous," she said evenly. "That is why I do not leave the house without this. You are standing inside my range, Mr. Cyrus." About 4 steps inside it. Cyrus's smile faltered. Hank, still on his horse, said quietly, "Cyrus, come on." Cyrus stood there another second. Then he backed up slowly. He mounted his horse. They rode out of the yard. Mabel watched them go. She did not put the rifle down until they were past the gate. She was shaking. She did not let Hattie see her hands. The middle of September brought the accident. It came on a Thursday. The hole was deep enough by then that Mabel had built a temporary set of bracing planks against the north wall, because that side was running into ground that had more clay and held more moisture. She had warned Owen not to stand at the base of that wall. Owen had been hauling a small bucket of soil, and he had not been thinking. He had set the bucket down right beside the bracing and was tying his bootlace. The wall let go. It made a soft, heavy sound like the inside of a barrel collapsing. The bracing came down and the wet earth behind it came down with it, and Owen went under to his knees in soil before he could even cry out. Mabel was up at the silo opening passing a tool down to Hattie. She heard the sound. She saw Hattie's face change. She did not remember climbing down the ladder. She did not remember which way she had come into the hole. She remembered only that she was on her knees in the dark, wet earth beside her son, digging with her bare hands, throwing soil behind her, calling his name in a voice that did not sound like hers. Hattie was at the lip of the hole above, lowering more empty buckets. She got him out. He was bruised down both legs and his right ankle had swollen, but he had not broken anything. He had cried only twice, both times softly. She carried him up the ladder herself. She would not let Hattie help. That night, she put Owen to bed with a hot stone wrapped in cloth against his ankle, and a story he had heard before but liked anyway. Then she went into the kitchen and she sat at the table with the lamp burning low, and she put her face into her hands, and for the first time since the spring of 1887, she cried. Not the small, wet-eyed crying of a sad afternoon, the other kind, the kind that comes from far down and does not stop quickly. Hattie heard her. Hattie was at her bedroom door in her nightdress listening. Hattie did not come into the kitchen. Hattie understood something that most 12-year-olds do not understand, which is that there are some moments when the kindest thing you can do for someone is leave them alone to break. In the morning, Mabel was at the breakfast table as if nothing had happened. Owen could not walk well for 3 days. The whole waited. The first kindness from the town came 2 days after the accident, from a quarter Mabel did not expect. She rode into Hollow Creek to buy more nails and another length of 2x4 planking. On her way back out, she stopped at the small apothecary shop run by Dr. Phineas Whitcomb, who was 55 years old from Boston originally, and who had drifted out to the Wyoming territory 12 years before for reasons he did not discuss. He was the only person in Hollow Creek who had ever spoken to Mabel as if she were a person and not a piece of gossip. She bought a small bottle of cough syrup for Owen, whose chest she did not like the sound of. Dr. Whitcomb counted out the coins. Then he looked at her over the top of his small reading spectacles. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I have heard a thing." "Yes," she said. "I have heard you are digging a room underneath the old grain silo on your rise. I have heard you intend to ride out the worst of the winter down there, with your children and some of your stock." She did not deny it. He nodded slowly. He turned and walked into the back of the shop and came back with a small, thin book bound in green cloth. He set it on the counter between them. "This is a French book," he said. "It is about how the winemakers of the Champagne country build their cellars. Some of what is in here may be useful to you. There is a chapter on how they handle moisture in the walls. There is a chapter on ventilation. The Lord knows what they would think of a woman from Ohio applying their ideas to a Wyoming winter, but the ground is the ground. It does the same thing in any country." She picked up the book. She held it in both hands. "I cannot afford to buy this," she said. "I am not selling it," he said. "I am loaning it. Bring it back in the spring." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the level, patient gaze of a man who had decided something quietly some time ago and was only now letting her know. "I have read about the Pawnee," he said. "Their earth lodges. Their people lived through winters out here that would have killed most white people. The ground does not lie, Mrs. Thorne. You go on. Bring me the book in May." She nodded once. She put the book in her basket. She rode home in the autumn light with the book under her arm, and she felt for the first time in many weeks that she was not entirely alone. The next visitor came at the start of October. Gerhard Kessler was 58 years old, born in the Ruhr country of Western Germany. where he had worked as a coal miner from the age of 14 until he was 31. He had come to America in 1860, lost his wife Anna to a blizzard in the winter of 1876, raised his son Tobias alone, and built up a small but well-run cattle outfit 3 miles north of the Thorne place on a low-rise of his own. He was a hard, careful, quiet man. He spoke English slowly, and he did not waste words. He rode in on a Tuesday morning. He did not dismount. He looked at the silo on the rise for a long time. Then he looked at Mabel, who had walked out into the yard to meet him. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I have heard." "Yes," she said. He looked back at the silo. He looked down at her again. He was not smiling. He had the face of a man who had spent 50 years measuring things. "I have seen many strange things in my life," he said. "A woman digging a room under a silo. This is one of the stranger ones." She said nothing. He nudged his horse closer. He nodded toward the silo. Then he said in his careful Ruhr-accented English, "The wood you brace with, for the north wall, use oak, not the pine. The pine will give in the wet." She blinked. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked at her with eyes that were so pale they were almost gray. "Because," he said, "we see what we see." He touched the brim of his hat. He turned his horse. He rode away. Mabel stood in her yard a long time after he was gone. She did not understand what had just happened. She would not understand for several more months, and she would not understand fully until the following August on a summer porch with a glass between them. But she filed the moment away, and the next afternoon she sent Hattie out behind the collapsed bunkhouse to gather the salvageable oak planking, and they used it for the north wall. In the last week of September, Mabel rode into Hollow Creek to pick up an order of nails from the general store. She tied her horse and walked inside, and just as the storekeeper raised his head to greet her, she heard from the back corner near the stove the low voice of Wendell Pike. She did not look at him directly. She knew the voice. She looked instead at the man Pike was speaking with. It was Reverend Josiah Crane. The two of them had their heads close. They were speaking quietly. The instant Mabel stepped fully into the room, they both fell silent. Pike turned his face. He saw her. He did the smile. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Mr. Pike," she said. "Reverend." Crane only nodded. His mouth was tight. She got her nails. She paid. She walked out. She mounted her horse in the street, and she sat there for a moment with her hands on the reins, and she felt the entire shape of the thing settle around her like a hand closing. The bank wanted her land. The church wanted an example. If she failed in the coming winter, Pike got the foreclosure and Crane got his sermon. They had been friendly enough on the surface for years. She had not understood until that minute that they were also allies. She rode home in the bright autumn cold, and she did not tell the children what she had seen. Pike came back at the very end of October. He came alone this time, except for a thin, pale young man in a town suit, whom he introduced as his bank's clerk. There was no marshal with him this time. He had calculated correctly that bringing the marshal twice in a season would begin to look like harassment. He stood in her yard in his black coat, and he told her in the same even gentle voice he always used that he was accelerating the timeline. The directors of the bank, he said, had grown concerned about her. Her behavior at the church had not gone unnoticed. The digging at the silo had not gone unnoticed. There were questions, he said, about whether a woman in her current state of mind ought to be holding such a substantial obligation. He was prepared this morning to take her note off the books and to put the homestead into the hands of the Boddicker brothers, who were waiting in town with cash money for the closing. She would have, he said, 3 days to be off the property. Mabel listened. She was wearing her work clothes. She was holding the rifle. She had not picked it up to threaten him. She had picked it up because she had been about to walk out to the pasture and check on a calf when his wagon had come up the track. She just happened to be holding the rifle. She let him finish. Then she lifted the rifle very slowly and laid it flat across the porch rail in front of her, the barrel pointed not at Pike but slightly to his left. She rested her hands on it lightly. "Mr. Pike," she said, in a voice as level as the porch rail itself, "you are going to get back in that wagon and you are going to drive off my land. You have got 3 minutes to do it. If you take longer, I am going to ride down to Hollow Creek myself this afternoon and have Marshal Holloway explain to you the territorial statute on trespass after refusal. Do you understand me?" Pike's color rose. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "you have just made a very bad enemy. I do not forget." "I never asked you to forget, Mr. Pike," she said. "I asked you to leave." He left. That night, she sat at the kitchen table again, and she counted the $47 and the cattle and the cloth and the silver pin. The $150 was due in 3 weeks. She did not have it. She could sell 4 of the old cows. That would bring her perhaps $50 in late autumn prices. She had thought about the silver pin once before and had set the thought aside. The pin had been her mother's. She had carried it from Ohio in a folded handkerchief. She was sitting there with the pin in her palm when Hattie came into the kitchen in her nightdress. Hattie was 12, she was barefoot, her hair was loose down her back. She walked to the table. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Mama." "Father would not mind." Mabel looked up at her. "I asked Dr. Whitcomb yesterday," Hattie said. "He said the pawnbroker in Cheyenne would pay $30 for it. He said he could send it on the next stagecoach." Mabel sat very still. "And he said Hattie said that he would loan you $30 more himself, with no interest, to be paid back when the cattle market is better in the spring. He said to tell you only if you came to a hard place." Mabel closed her hand around the silver pin. "I am keeping our home," Mama Hattie said. "That is all. Father wanted us to keep it." Mabel pulled her daughter into her arms. She did not weep. She held her hard against her chest for a long minute. Then she let her go and sent her back to bed. She sat at the table for another hour. She did the arithmetic 3 times to be sure. 4 old cows at $12 apiece, $48. The pin to Cheyenne, $30. The loan from Dr. Whitcomb, $30. Plus the 47 in the tin box. The total was $155. She would make the Thanksgiving payment, but she understood sitting there in the lamplight with the pin in front of her that making this payment did not save her. It bought her 3 months. The next note came due on the 1st of March. $250. Pike had structured the schedule on purpose. He had timed it so the next due date fell at the back end of winter when she could have neither sold the cattle nor done any new work. If the winter that the old-timers were predicting was as bad as they said, her remaining herd would not survive the season. She would arrive at the 1st of March with nothing left to sell and a note she could not pay. The room beneath the silo was no longer a strange idea. It was the only thing standing between her family and the bottom of the year. She rose from the table. She put out the lamp. She walked through the dark kitchen and out the back door and across the yard in her nightdress and her work boots with no coat. The October air bit at her face and her hands. She climbed the rise to the silo. She opened the side door. She lit the small lantern she kept on the shelf inside. She climbed down the temporary ladder into the half-finished hole. The walls of the hole rose around her. The lantern light was small. The earth smelled of old roots and of cold. She knelt on the dirt floor. She pressed her right hand palm flat against the wall. The earth was not warm. She had never said it was warm, but it was not the killing thing the wind was. It was something else. It was patient. It was indifferent to seasons. It was waiting. "Just hold us until the spring," she whispered to nothing and to no one. "Just to the spring." Above her, very far above the floor of the hole, she could hear the first true cold wind of the season starting up. It moved through the gaps in the old silo planking with a thin whistling note that would in a few more weeks become a roar. She stayed down there a long time before she climbed up and walked back to the house and put herself to bed. On the morning of the 20th of November, 1888, Mabel Thorne walked into the Hollow Creek Bank with $150 in a folded handkerchief and laid the handkerchief on Wendell Pike's desk without speaking. Pike stared at it for a long moment. Then he opened the handkerchief and counted the money. He counted it twice. He counted it a third time slowly, as if the act of counting might cause some of the bills to disappear. When he could not make them disappear, he picked up his pen and he wrote out a receipt, and his hand was steady, but the corners of his mouth had gone tight in a way that made him look for the first time since Mabel had known him, like a man who had been struck a small blow he had not seen coming. She took the receipt, she folded it, she put it inside her coat. At the door she stopped because Pike had spoken. "You bought yourself 3 months, Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Not a day more. The next note falls on the 1st of March. $250. You will not raise it, not coming out of a winter like the one we are walking into." She turned and looked at him. She understood then with a kind of cold completeness that the schedule had not been an accident. He had set the next due date to fall at the back end of the worst season of the year, when no cattle could be moved and no work could be done, and no honest woman could turn a dollar. He had set it there on purpose. He had set it there to break her. She did not answer him. She walked out into the November light, and she rode home, and she did not tell the children what Pike had said. That had been 2 days after the night Cyrus Boddicker came back. That night had been the 18th of November, just after midnight. Owen was the one who woke. He came into his mother's room in his bare feet and shook her shoulder. There was a sound from the silo, he said. Not the wind, a different sound, like somebody walking around the outside of it. Mabel was awake instantly. She rose without speaking. She pulled her coat over her nightdress and pushed her bare feet into her work boots. She took the rifle from over the door. She told Owen to stay with Hattie in the kitchen and not to come out for anything. She went out into the yard. The night was clear and very cold. The moon was a thin curve over the eastern ridge. The silo on the rise stood gray and silent, and at first she saw nothing. Then a small shape moved at the base of the silo, low and crouching. She heard the soft clink of glass against wood. She brought the rifle up to her shoulder. She moved across the yard quickly and quietly. 20 paces from the silo she could see him. Cyrus Boddicker, crouched against the south wall of the silo with a tin can of kerosene in one hand and a box of Strike Anywhere matches in the other. He was pouring the kerosene in a careful line along the base of the wooden planking. He had not seen her yet. He was working with the focused, dumb concentration of a man who had been drinking and was now sober enough to be afraid of what he had decided to do. Mabel did not announce herself. She raised the rifle to the night sky, sighted along the barrel at nothing, and fired one round. The crack of the shot rolled across the yard like a board breaking in half. Cyrus went down as if she had hit him. The tin can flew sideways and the kerosene poured across the snow. The matches scattered. He scrambled away from the wall on his hands and knees, his eyes wish-eyed and white in the moonlight, and when he turned and saw her standing 20 feet from him, with the rifle now lowered and pointed at his chest, he made a sound that was not quite a word. She walked toward him. She did not hurry. She stopped 6 feet from where he was kneeling in the snow, and she looked down at him. "Get up," she said. He got up. "Walk to your horse," she said. "Mount it. Ride off my land. Do not look back. If you look back, I will put the next one through your shoulder. Do you understand me?" He nodded. He could not speak. He stumbled to where he had tied his horse behind the brush at the edge of her property. He mounted clumsily the way a man mounts who has lost feeling in his legs. He rode off into the dark without looking back even once. Mabel stood in her yard for a long time after he was gone. The kerosene was a dark fan on the white snow against the south wall of the silo. The matches lay scattered like small bones. If she had not woken when Owen woke, if Owen had not heard the sound, the silo would be on fire right now, and the hole beneath it filled in with hot ash and the work of 4 months gone with it. She walked back to the house. She put the rifle above the door. She put coffee on the stove. When Hattie and Owen came out of the kitchen in their nightclothes, she sat them both down at the table, and she told them what had happened, all of it, in the same even voice she used when she was teaching them to read aloud. She told them because she had decided years before that fear hidden from children was worse than fear told plainly. Hattie listened with her brown eyes wide. Owen listened with his small hands folded on the table. "You did right," she told Owen. "You heard the sound and you came and got me. That is what a man does in this family." Owen nodded very seriously. The next morning she rode into Hollow Creek and she sat in Marshall Holloway's office and she told him exactly what had happened. The marshal listened with his arms folded. He took notes. When she was finished, he set the pencil down and rubbed the back of his neck. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I believe every word of what you have told me, but the fact is there were no witnesses. The kerosene can he left behind could have been anybody's. Cyrus Boddicker will swear on a stack of Bibles that he was home in his bed. I cannot bring a charge with what I have." "I understand," she said, but the marshal said, and now he leaned forward, "I am going to ride out and have a conversation with both of the Boddicker brothers this afternoon. I am going to make it clear to them that I have heard about a kerosene can and that I have heard about a fire that almost was. They will know they are being watched. That is the most I can do for you today." She thanked him. She rode home. It was the first time in 3 years of widowhood that any official voice in Hollow Creek had taken her side of anything. She rode home with that small fact warm in her chest like a stone she had carried up from a hot spring. She had finished the hole already by then. Through the first 10 days of November, she and the children had worked on what she now called, only in her own mind, the room. She had braced the walls with the oak planking from the collapsed bunkhouse, the wood Gerhard Kessler had told her to use without telling her why. She had tamped the floor flat and covered it first with dry straw and then with loose boards that could be lifted if any moisture came up from below. The ceiling she had built of the heaviest timber she had on the place. She had packed the gaps between the beams with a mixture of dried prairie gums and the clay-heavy subsoil from the deeper part of the dig. She had tested the ceiling by standing on it from above with a full hay bale beside her. It did not flex. The trapdoor had been set into the silo floor with iron hinges and a rope pull system that Hattie could work alone. Inside, on the underside of the trapdoor, Mabel had attached an iron hook and a wooden bar so that anyone in the room below could lock the door against anything that might try to come through it from above. After the Cyrus night, she made the lock heavier. She added a second bar. She had run a small iron stove pipe up through the ceiling, through the silo floor, and out through a hole she had cut in the south wall of the silo near the eaves. The stove itself, a small black thing on 4 legs, had been shipped to her from Cheyenne the previous spring by her dead husband's brother. She had set it on a square of flat stones in the southeast corner of the room. She had cut a narrow ventilation channel along the west wall, running up at a slight angle to a fist-sized opening in the silo's outer foundation, fitted with a small wooden flap that could be opened or closed from inside. The room had been finished on the 11th of November. She had lit the stove for the first time on the evening of the 12th. It had been a Monday night, very cold. She had brought the children down through the trapdoor with 2 wool blankets and a small stack of books. She had built a low bench along the east wall out of 2 boards in 4 chunks of hewn log. She lit the stove and waited for it to draw, and after a while a thin curl of clean wood smoke began to move quietly up through the pipe and out into the night above. She sat down on the bench with a tin cup of coffee she had carried down, still hot from the house. Hattie sat at the other end of the bench, with a book open in her lap and the lantern set on a shelf above her. Owen lay on a pile of blankets against the south wall on his side, asleep almost before his head was down, the way 9-year-old boys sleep when they have worked all day and trust that someone older is keeping watch. The room was not warm. Mabel was clear about this with herself. She was not sitting in a parlor in Ohio. But the air did not bite. The air was still. The walls held a kind of patience that the surface world had never held, not in any season she could remember. She sat there with the coffee in her hands and she watched her daughter read. The lamp threw the shadow of Hattie's bent head onto the earthen wall behind her. The shadow was steady. The wind somewhere far above the trap door had begun to rise, but down here she could not hear it, not as a voice. She could hear it only as a soft pressure at the edge of perception, like the breathing of a very large animal, somewhere on the other side of a heavy curtain. For the first time since the morning the fever had taken Silas, Mabel felt something she could not put a name to. It was not safety. Safety was too large a word for what a widow on the high plains was ever permitted to feel. It was something quieter than safety. It was the thing a person feels when they have made a hard decision and then done the work and then sat down to see whether the work would hold, and the work has held. She drank her coffee. She did not weep, but she sat on the bench for a long time before she rose to put the stove down for the night, and when she finally stood up, she did so the way a person stands up from a chair where someone they loved used to sit with care. The first kindness from her own valley came on the 27th of November. There was a knock at the back door of the house after dark, soft but steady. Mabel opened the door with the rifle in her left hand. Ottilie Renfrew stood on the step. She was wrapped in a heavy gray shawl over her dress, and she was holding her youngest child in her arms, a little girl of about 3 years, whose face was very flushed and whose breath was wet and rattling. Behind Ottilie's shoulder, out at the edge of the yard, Mabel could see August Renfrew sitting on the wagon seat with his hat pulled low. He was not looking toward the house. He was giving his wife privacy. Ottilie's eyes were red. "Mabel," she said, "the child has been sick 3 days. Dr. Whitcomb is out of the cough syrup and has nothing more until the stage comes through next week." I did not know where else to go. Mabel set the rifle aside. She held out her arms. Ottilie passed the little girl into them. The child was hot to the touch. Mabel laid her hand against the little forehead, then at the side of the small neck. She turned and carried the child into the kitchen and laid her on the kitchen table on top of a folded quilt. She lit a second lamp. Ottilie stood in the doorway with her arms folded tightly against her own chest, as if she did not trust her arms to be useful. "Mabel," she said more quietly, "I came here because there is no one else, but I came here also because I owe you something." Mabel did not look up from the child. She was unbuttoning the small wool jacket. "I have said things about you," Ottilie said. "I have stood with my own husband on our porch and said things about you. After what Cyrus Boddicker tried to do to your silo, I could not sleep. I lay awake and I thought about the things I had said. I had said you were grief-mad. I had said you were turning into a hermit. I had said the digging was a sign your mind was going. I said those things to August. I said them to my sister in Cheyenne in a letter. I said them, Mabel. I am here tonight in part because my child is sick. and in part because I needed to look at you in the face and say it out loud. Mabel took a bottle of cough syrup from the cabinet above the sink, the one Dr. Whitcomb had given her in October when Owen's chest had sounded thick. She measured out a small dose and lifted the little girl's head and got the syrup into her. The child swallowed, coughed once, and quieted. Mabel covered her with the quilt. Then she straightened and turned and looked at Ottilie. Ottilie, she said, I do not need an apology. I need a neighbor. Are you willing to be that? Ottilie's mouth trembled. She nodded once, then twice, then she put her face in her hands and her shoulders shook silently because she did not want August to see her cry. Mabel walked across the kitchen and put her arms around her, and they stood that way for almost a minute. Two women who had been raised in different parts of the country and who had been pushed for too many years into the role of cautious strangers holding each other in a small kitchen on the high plains while a sick child slept on a table behind them. When Ottilie left with the child wrapped tight against her shoulder and a second bottle of the syrup tucked into her shawl, August lifted his hat to Mabel from the wagon seat in a way he had never lifted it to her before. The first week of December brought Dr. Whitcomb out to the homestead in his small black buggy. He came in the middle of the afternoon alone. He sat at her kitchen table, and he refused her offer of coffee, and he came to the point. Wendell Pike has been to see me, he said. Twice. The second time was yesterday. Mabel waited. He has been asking me questions, the doctor said, of a peculiar kind. He has been asking whether, in my professional opinion as a physician, you are showing signs of what he called prolonged grief disturbance. He used the word melancholia. He used the phrase, and I am quoting him, exactly mental unfitness to manage a homestead and to raise minor children. She set her own cup down very carefully. What he is fishing for, the doctor said, is a signed medical statement. With such a statement, he could petition the probate court in Cheyenne for an emergency guardianship. The children would be placed temporarily with a court-appointed guardian. The homestead would be administered by the bank during the proceedings. Even if the petition failed in the end, the proceedings themselves would take a year. He would have the property. He would have what he has been working toward all along. She felt the kitchen tilt very slightly. I want to be clear, the doctor said, leaning forward, that I refused him. I refused him the first time. I refused him again yesterday. I told him plainly that you are one of the most clear-minded individuals in this county and that I would not put my name to anything to the contrary. I told him that if he came back a third time, I would write to the Territorial Medical Board about him. I do not think he will come back. She nodded slowly. But Dr. Whitcomb said, and he held her eyes with his pale ones, he is now looking for a different lever. He cannot get the medical statement, so he is looking for evidence. If anything happens to either of those children this winter, Mabel, anything at all that he can dress up as neglect, he will use it. A cough, a fall, a frostbite, a fever that goes too long without being seen. He will collect the names of every person who hears about it, and he will file his petition in the spring. She understood. She did not have to be told what he was telling her. I am not just keeping them alive this winter, she said almost to herself. I am keeping them perfect. The doctor reached across the table and laid his hand briefly over hers. You will, he said. You already are. He left in the dropping light. She stood at the window after he was gone and watched his buggy go down the wagon track, smaller and smaller, against the great brown emptiness. And she thought about the word perfect and what it would cost. By the last week of January, the old-timers along that stretch of the territory had been reading the signs for nearly a month. The elk had come down out of the hills earlier than anyone had ever seen them come down. They had not stopped to graze. They had moved south and east in long, quiet lines as if they had been called. The ravens had gathered on the dead cottonwood above Gerhard Kessler's barn in numbers nobody could remember seeing before, and then one morning all of them had been gone. The sky in the afternoons had taken on a flatness that was not the bright, cold gray of a normal winter, but something duller, something heavier like a piece of dirty pewter held at an angle to the light. In the silo on Mabel's rise, the mice had quietly relocated themselves to the room beneath the trapdoor, every last one of them, as if they had known about the room before she had finished it and had only been waiting for her permission. She did not chase them out. They would eat a little of the grain she had stored. She could afford it. They would also, in their small way, tell her things about the air down there that she could not tell herself. She moved the last 2 calves down on a Tuesday. She filled the water barrels in the corners while the pump was still running freely. She brought down the cured ham, the sack of beans, the small wooden crate of apples, the cornmeal, the salt. She brought down the books. She brought down the children's heaviest coats and laid them on the pegs along the south wall. She brought down 4 extra wool blankets. On Thursday afternoon, she stood on her porch and looked at the sky and called the children in early. It was just after the sun went down on Thursday evening that the knock came at her door. She opened it with the rifle in her hand. A young man stood on the step, taller than she was, broad through the shoulders, his coat dusted with the fine dry snow that the rising wind had begun to throw. His face was Gerhard Kessler's face 30 years younger. "Tobias Kessler," she said. "Ma'am," he said. He held out a folded paper. She took it. "My father wrote it," he said. She opened the paper. The handwriting was the slow, careful, printed hand of a man whose first language was not English. "Mrs. Thorne, this storm is bad. I think your way is right. I send my son and some tools. He understands the water. Do not tell anyone I sent him. Gerhard." She looked up at the young man. "He understands the water," she said. "I worked the brown coal galleries with my father when I was 12, he said. Before we came to America, I know how to make a wall keep dry when the ground is wet. May I see your room?" She brought him through the house and out the back and up the rise. She lit a second lantern from her first. She opened the trap door and they went down together. Tobias Kessler stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and turned in a slow circle and took in the bracing and the floor and the ceiling and the stove and the vent. Then he set his canvas bag down and he opened it. He worked beside her until 2 in the morning. The wind by then was rising hard. They could hear it through the silo planking above them, a long building roar that did not yet have words attached to it. He showed her how to cut a small drainage channel along the inside base of the north wall, slanted just enough to carry any seepage along the wall instead of letting it pool. He laid a course of small, flat field stones at the base of the channel so it would not silt up. He widened the ventilation flap by 1.5 inches and showed her how to set it half open so that the air would move without bringing in real cold. He worked without speaking mostly. When he spoke at all, it was in short sentences. "Use this here, cut that there. Good." When he was done, he stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees and put his tools back into the canvas bag. She walked him up the ladder and out into the yard. The wind hit them like a hand. He pulled his hat down hard. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Yes," she said. "My father said to tell you something." She waited. "The earth will hold you," he said, "if you hold the earth." He mounted his horse. He rode off into the dark. She watched him go until he was swallowed by the blowing snow. The storm did not arrive on Friday morning the way an ordinary storm arrives. It did not come in like a door swinging open. It came in like a door being torn off its hinges and thrown across the room. She woke the children before dawn. She had already cooked breakfast on the house stove the evening before, and she had wrapped it in 2 cloths and packed it in a basket. She put the basket and the books and the children's blankets into Hattie's arms, and she pushed Hattie out through the back door first. Owen she carried. They crossed the yard with their heads down against a wind that was no longer wind in any ordinary sense of the word. It was something else. It was a presence. It moved across the high plains like an animal looking for something to take. The cold inside it was not the cold of December. It was a deeper thing. The mercury in the small thermometer on the porch post had dropped below the lowest mark on its glass. She got them down through the trap door. She climbed down after them and pulled the door closed and threw both bars across. She lit the stove. She fed it slowly. The children settled into the corner by the south wall with the blankets and the books and the basket of breakfast. Hattie began to read aloud to Owen in a low, steady voice, more for her own steadiness than for his. Mabel sat on the bench and she listened to her daughter's voice, and she watched the small black stove begin to do its work. Then she remembered the calf. It came back to her with a small cold drop in her chest. The 6-month-old heifer. The one with the white face. The one she had set aside last spring mentally as Hattie's dowry calf. The one she would give her daughter when Hattie married someday, in a country Mabel could not yet see. The calf was not in the room. The calf was still in the small lean-to shelter on the far side of the silo, 200 feet across open ground. She had meant to bring it down the night before. She had been so taken up with Tobias Kessler in the drainage that she had forgotten. She stood up. Hattie stopped reading. Mama, Hattie said. Mabel went to the south wall and took down the heaviest coat. She wrapped a wool scarf twice around her face. She pulled on her work gloves. The heifer, she said. I forgot her last night. She is in the lean-to. You cannot go out there, Hattie said. Her voice had risen. You cannot go out there in this. You will not find your way back. I am going to tie a rope to the base of the silo ladder, Mabel said very calmly. I am going to pay it out as I go. I will follow it back. I will not be longer than half an hour. Mama. Hattie was on her feet now. Owen was sitting up in the blankets, his eyes huge. Mabel walked to her daughter. She took the rifle down from where she had leaned it against the bench, and she put it into Hattie's hands. You listen to me, she said. If I am not back through that trap door in 1 hour, you close it. You drop both bars. You do not open it for anybody. Not for a voice you think is mine. Not for anybody. You wait until the storm is over and you go and find August Renfrew. Do you understand me? Hattie nodded. Tears were running down her face. She did not wipe them. You are the woman of this house. If I am not back, Mabel said. Owen is the man. You take care of each other. You hear me? Yes, Hattie said. Mabel kissed her daughter on the forehead. She kissed Owen on the top of his head. She climbed the ladder. She unbarred the trap door. She lifted it. The cold that fell into the room was a living thing. She climbed out into it and pulled the trap door closed behind her without latching it. She tied one end of a coil of rope to the bottom rung of the silo ladder. She tied the other end around her waist. She stepped out into the storm. The rope at her waist was the only true thing in the world. She could not see the silo behind her. She could not see the lean-to ahead of her. She could not see her own hands when she held them in front of her face. The wind had taken the daylight and ground it down into a single white howl that pushed against her body from the north with the steady weight of something that wanted her to stop walking. She walked anyway. She paid the rope out behind her, foot by foot, and she counted her steps in a low voice inside the scarf because the counting kept her from thinking. 40 steps, 60, 80. She fell once and the cold reached up through the snow and tried to put its hand inside her coat. She got up. She kept counting. 120. The lean-to should be at 180. At 190, her glove struck the corner post. She felt her way along the wall. She got the door open with her shoulder. Inside, the lean-to the air was almost still, but the cold was waiting in it like water in a well. The heifer was lying down in the back corner on her side, eyes half closed. Frost had formed along the inside of her ears. Mabel went to her knees beside her and put both gloved hands on the animal's neck and pressed. The heifer breathed. The breath was small, but it was there. Mabel had brought a length of soft rope coiled across her shoulder. She got the rope around the heifer's neck and under her front legs in a sling, the way Silas had once shown her years before for moving a sick animal that could not be ridden. She braced her boots in the dirt of the lean-to floor, and she pulled. The heifer came up onto her front knees. Mabel pulled again. The animal got her hind legs under her. She got the heifer to the lean-to door. She got her out into the storm. She followed the long rope back, hand over hand, with the heifer stumbling beside her. The animal's shoulder pressed against Mabel's hip for balance. The wind tried to push them apart. Twice it almost did. The second time Mabel slipped and went down on her face into a drift and lay there for a long second with the cold underneath her and the warmth of the animal still pressed against her side. And she had a thought she did not want to have, which was that it would not be so hard to stay down. She got up. She got up because Hattie was waiting at the trapdoor with the rifle, and because Owen was 9 years old, and because she had promised her son in the kitchen on the morning of the 11th of July that she would not let the country take this family from him. She got up. She found the silo wall with her gloved hand. She found the small side door. She pushed the heifer in first and pulled the door closed behind her and stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the silo interior, gasping into her scarf, her lungs burning. Then she knelt by the trap door and she pounded on it 3 times with the side of her fist. Hattie pulled the trap door up. Mabel saw her daughter's face by the light of the lantern below. Hattie's eyes were red and her cheeks were wet, but her hands were steady on the rifle, and she had not let it droop. "Get back," Mabel said. "I have to lower her down." She tied a second rope to the sling. She braced her boots against the silo floor on either side of the open hatch. She lowered the half-frozen heifer through the trapdoor opening, slow and even, hand over hand. Hattie guided the animal's legs as she came down. The heifer slid the last 2 feet, and Owen caught her by the head, his small body pressed against the animal's chest, holding her steady. Mabel followed down the ladder and pulled the trapdoor shut and threw both bars across. They got the heifer next to the stove. Owen wrapped both of his arms around the animal's neck and laid his own face against the white blaze and would not let go. Hattie rubbed the heifer's flank with a rough cloth in long, hard strokes, the way her father had once shown her. Mabel knelt by the stove and fed the fire. The heifer's eyes came open. After a while, she sighed. Then Owen began to cry. He cried into the side of the heifer's neck without making a sound, the way a child cries when he has been holding himself still for too long. Mabel did not stop him. She let him cry. She put her hand flat on his small back and held it there. After a while, she got up and made coffee on the top of the stove. The first day of the storm went by underground. They ate the cold breakfast in the basket. They read aloud. Owen fell asleep against the heifer and did not wake for 4 hours. Mabel sat on the bench and watched the small wooden flap of the ventilation channel move in and out, half open, exactly as Tobias Kessler had said it. The mice in the corners did not move at all. They had settled in long before the storm, and they had the wisdom of small animals, which is the wisdom of staying very still and waiting for something larger to pass. It was on the second morning that the footsteps came overhead. Mabel had been expecting them. The footsteps crossed the silo floor heavily twice, and then the trapdoor was lifted from above. Cold gray light fell into the room. A man's boots came down through the opening, slow, careful, and then a man's head and shoulders, and then the rest of him, August Renfrew, his face half covered by a wool scarf that had frozen stiff with the moisture of his own breath. He turned at the bottom of the ladder and he looked around the room. He looked at the stove. He looked at the heifer lying calm now beside the south wall. He looked at Hattie reading aloud by the lantern light. He looked at Mabel sitting on the bench with a tin cup of coffee in her hands. He did not say anything for almost half a minute. Then he reached up and pulled the scarf away from his mouth, and he walked 3 steps into the center of the room, and he laid one bare hand flat against the earthen wall, the way he must have seen his own wife do something similar with a child's forehead 1,000 times. He held his hand there. "Lord," he said. It was not quite a sentence. It carried the weight of one. Mabel rose and walked to the shelf by the stove. She took down the second tin cup she had set there the night before, and she poured coffee into it from the pot, and she carried it to him. "I figured you would come first," she said. He took the cup, he drank. He could not speak, he drank again. His wife and his 3 children were in his kitchen. He told her finally, his voice rough. They had burned through half their wood already. The youngest, the one Mabel had treated in November, had been coughing through the night and was burning hot again. The middle child had cried herself out and gone silent, which August said quietly was worse than the crying. Ottilie had sent him. She had sent him with one word, which had been please. He stood holding the empty cup in both hands. "I do not know how to ask," he said. "You do not have to ask," Mabel said. "Bring them." He went back up the ladder. He was gone almost 3 hours. The wind above had not eased. Mabel sat with the children and the heifer, and she made fresh coffee, and she warmed the last of the breakfast bread on the top of the stove, and she did not let herself think about what would happen if August did not come back. She had given him a length of her own rope, and she had stood at the trap door and watched him tie it to the silo ladder and pay it out behind him as he stepped into the white wall of the storm, and that was the last she could do for him from where she stood. He came back. He came back with all 4 of them. Ottilie carrying the youngest, the 2 older children stumbling under their wool coats. August at the rear, pushing them forward, one hand on each shoulder of the boy in front of him. They came down the ladder one at a time. Mabel caught each child at the bottom and set them down on the dry straw by the stove. Ottilie came down last, and when her feet touched the floor of the room, she held out the youngest child to Mabel without a word. The little girl was hot, and her breath was thin and rattling. Mabel laid her on the bench with a folded blanket beneath her. She got the small bottle of Dr. Whitcomb's syrup from the high shelf where she had stored it for exactly this. She measured a dose. She tipped the small head back and got the syrup down. She laid a cloth dipped in cool water across the small forehead. She covered the child in the bench with 2 more blankets, and she sat down on the edge of the bench, and she put her own hand on the child's chest and counted breaths. After a little while, the breath was easier. Ottilie was watching her. The 2 of them did not speak. Ottilie's hands were shaking in her lap, and her face was the color of old paper. Mabel reached across with her free hand and took both of Ottilie's hands and held them. That night, on the second night of the storm, the small room beneath the silo held 9 living creatures, 2 women, 5 children, a white-faced heifer, the mice in the corners who continued in their way to keep counsel with all of them. The stove ticked through its cycles. The lantern burned low. The wind above, when anyone listened for it, sounded very far away, like a thing happening to someone else. Ottilie slept with her youngest child against her chest. Mabel slept on the floor next to Hattie with one arm flung across her daughter's shoulder, the rifle within reach against the wall. The morning of the 3rd day was the morning the knocking came. It was not the kind of knocking that a man makes who is asking to be admitted. It was the kind a man makes who is going to die if he is not let in. It struck the trap door in short, hard, panicked bursts, each blow weaker than the one before. Mabel was on her feet with the rifle in her hands before any of the children were even awake. She climbed the ladder, Hattie climbed behind her with the lantern. Mabel held one ear to the underside of the trapdoor and listened. The knocking stopped. There was a voice. The voice was breaking. She could not make out the words. She lifted the trapdoor. Cyrus Boddicker fell into the room. He fell because he had been leaning against the trap door when she opened it, and he had nothing left in him to hold himself up. He came down the ladder in a slide that was not quite a fall, and he landed on his hands and knees on the straw floor and stayed there. His face was bone white where it was not blue. The flesh of his nose and one cheekbone had gone the color of bad meat. His lips were split. He could not stand up. He looked up at Mabel from where he was kneeling on the floor of the room she had built, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who knew exactly what he had done in the fall and exactly what he was asking for now. "Hank," he said. He swallowed. "Hank is dead. I went out to look for the south herd, and I lost my way coming back to the house. I have been walking since yesterday afternoon. I do not know how I found your silo. I do not know." Mabel stood very still. She was a tall woman, and she stood looking down at the man who had come in November with a tin of kerosene and a box of matches and meant to burn the silo down on top of the work of 4 months and the safety of her children. She stood looking at him for what felt like a long time and was probably 10 seconds. She felt Hattie's hand close around her sleeve. "Mama," Hattie said. It was one word. It was the only word in the room. Mabel set the rifle down on the bench. She took off her own outer coat. She walked the 3 steps to where Cyrus knelt on the floor, and she draped the coat across his shoulders. "Sit by the stove," she said. "Hattie, bring hot water." She helped him to the stove herself. She did not look at Audley, who was watching from the corner with her child still in her arms. She did not look at August, who was watching from the south wall with an expression that was not pity, but was something close to a deeper recognition of who his neighbor was. She set Cyrus against the wall by the stove, and she rubbed his hands between her own to bring the feeling back. And when Hattie brought the warm water, she made him drink it slowly in small sips, the way you bring a man back from the edge of the cold. He wept the whole time without sound. He could not seem to stop. She let him weep. The storm broke on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It broke the way those storms always broke, with no warning, as if some great hand had reached down out of the sky and simply lifted the noise away. One minute the wind was a roaring presence above the silo. The next minute there was only a thin, clear silence and the small ticking of the stove inside. Mabel climbed the ladder. She lifted the trapdoor. She climbed up into the silo, and she went to the side door, and she pushed it open, and she stepped out into the white aftermath of what the high plains had done to themselves. The light was hard. The sun stood over the eastern ridge in a clear blue sky and threw itself off the snow in a way that hurt the eyes. Her cattle, the 14 that remained after she had sold the 4 old ones in November, were alive. Gaunt, slow-moving, but alive. The 2 calves were alive in the room below. The heifer was alive against the stove. Her firewood reserve was down by 1/3 no more. Her family was alive. Her neighbors were alive in the room beneath her boots. She stood in the cold, bright, still niches with her bare hands at her eyes, and she did not weep because by then she was past weeping. She stood and looked at the country that had tried to take her and had not taken her, and she thought of Silas briefly, and she thought that he would have understood what she was looking at, and that was enough. Dr. Whitcomb rode out to the homestead on the 5th day. He had heard already somehow in the way that news traveled in that country even before the roads were clear. He told her what he had heard. Hank Boddicker was dead, as Cyrus had said. They had found him in the snow 200 yards from his own house, sitting upright against a fence post, frozen, his eyes still open. Gerhard Kessler had lost 4 head of cattle, his oldest and his youngest, including the bull he had been counting on for spring. He had not slept for 2 days fighting the cold off the rest of his herd in a barn that had not been built for what had come. He was alive. Tobias was alive. The Renfrew family the doctor knew about already because Mabel had sent August up to tell him on the day the road first opened. The youngest Boddicker brother had not died yet but was not expected to last the week because pneumonia had set into both lungs. Wendell Pike, the doctor said, had come through the storm comfortably enough. His house in town was solid and he had wood, but 3 of his largest borrowers had not. The Boddicker note was now worthless. 2 other ranching families to the west had lost so much stock that they would not be able to make their spring payments. Pike was, by Whitcomb's careful estimate, looking at the worst quarter of his career. And Reverend Crane, Mabel asked. The doctor's mouth twitched. Reverend Crane held his Sunday service yesterday morning, the doctor said. 11 people came. The congregation had been close to 90 the Sunday before the storm. Mabel sat with that for a moment. She did not feel pleasure at any of it. She had expected to feel pleasure. She felt instead something closer to a steady tiredness, a sense that the country had collected what it had decided to collect, and that her job now was to take what was left and to keep going. Cyrus Boddicker stayed in her house for 3 days. He could not ride for the first 2. By the 3rd morning, the color had come back into his face, except where the frost had killed the skin, and that would be with him the rest of his life, a small white patch high on the right cheekbone. He sat at her kitchen table on the 3rd morning with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and he could not look at her. He told her about his brother. He told her about the kerosene night. He had not slept since. He had drunk through most of it. The drinking had not helped. He told her in pieces with long silences between what had really been going on with Hank for the last 2 years. Hank had been deeply in debt to Wendell Pike. The Boddicker outfit had been hemorrhaging money for 3 seasons. Pike had been carrying the debt quietly, but Pike did not carry anything for free. Pike had made an arrangement with Hank. If the Boddickers could acquire the Thorne place by purchase or by other means, Pike would forgive the back interest and rewrite the note at favorable terms. The way Pike had explained it to Hank, no one would have to get hurt. The widow would simply find herself unable to hold her ground and would sell the way widows generally did. That had been the original plan. It had been the plan Hank had brought home and explained to Cyrus over whiskey more than once. It had not gone the way Pike had said it would. The widow had not folded. The widow had paid her Thanksgiving note in cash. The widow had a hole in the ground that everyone had been laughing at, and the widow had a rifle, and the widow had not folded. And then Pike had come to Hank in early November, Cyrus said, and Pike had suggested in his quiet voice that perhaps a more direct approach was needed. Perhaps an accident. Pike had not said the word arson. Pike had not said any specific word. Pike had only said that obstacles could be removed and that men who removed them might have their debts removed in turn. It had been Hank who had decided to send Cyrus. Cyrus had not wanted to go. Cyrus had gone anyway. That was the truth. When he had finished, Cyrus sat at her kitchen table and waited for whatever she was going to do. Mabel sat across from him for a long minute. Then she said, "You will work for me through the spring. You will sleep in the handbunk in the barn. You will eat at this table at the same hours my children do. You will not take $1 in wages until I say you have earned one. If you steal from me or lie to me one time, I will not call Marshall Holloway. I will handle it myself. Do you understand me?" He nodded. He could not speak. She poured him more coffee. The next note came due on the 1st of March. She had been counting the days since the storm broke. She had been counting them with a peculiar clarity. She knew exactly what was about to happen. On the morning of the 25th of February, the wagon she had been listening for came up her track. It was Wendell Pike. He was not alone. He was not with Marshall Holloway, and he was not with the bank's clerk this time. With Pike were two men she did not know. Hard-faced men in long coats who rode their own horses behind the wagon at an easy distance and dismounted when the wagon stopped and stood at the corners of the yard the way men stand when they are being paid to stand there. Mabel was on the porch. She had been expecting this exactly. She had been expecting it because the doctor had ridden out to see her 4 days before and had told her with a tightness in his voice that she had not heard from him before that Pike had been seen at the Cheyenne train depot the previous week and had been seen there with two men from out of the territory, two men of a particular kind, and that the doctor had a friend at the depot who had asked some questions about who those men had ridden in with and where they were now staying. Dr. Whitcomb had then ridden the same evening the 3 miles north to Gerhardt Kessler's place. Pike climbed down out of his wagon. He smiled the smile he always smiled. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I have come to discuss the orderly transfer of the property. I have brought witnesses to the transaction." The two men at the corners of the yard let their hands settle a little nearer to where their hands lived when they were paid to stand at corners of yards. Mabel did not answer Pike directly. She said only, "August." The front door of the house opened behind her. August Renfrew stepped out onto the porch beside her with his shotgun across his arm. "Gerhardt," she said. From the south side of the silo, walking slowly into the yard, came Gerhardt Kessler. He was carrying his old hunting rifle, the one he had brought with him from Germany 30 years before. He came until he was within 20 paces of the nearer of the two hard-faced men, and he stopped there, and he did not lower the rifle, but he did not raise it either. He just stood with it across his body and he watched. "Cyrus," she said. From the corner of the barn in his work clothes, with the small revolver his brother had carried in life, now belted at his hip with the holster's flap open, came Cyrus Boddicker. He walked out to the second hard-faced man, and he stopped within 10 feet of him, and he said evenly, "I know what you were hired to do. I know it because I almost was hired to do something like it once myself. I am asking you, friend, to consider very carefully what you do in the next minute." The hard-faced man did not move. Pike had gone the color of old milk, and from down the wagon track, from the direction of Hollow Creek, riding at an unhurried pace because he had been timing the visit, came Marshall Holloway on his sorrel gelding. He came up the track and into the yard, and he reined in 20 feet from Pike's wagon, and he sat his horse and he looked around at the assembled tableau with the slow, patient eyes of a man who had not been surprised by anything in 15 years. "Mr. Pike," the marshal said, "step away from the wagon." Pike stepped away. "The two gentlemen at the corners of the yard," the marshal said, "will please remove their gun belts and place them on the ground and walk over to my horse with their hands where I can see them. Dr. Whitcomb at the depot in Cheyenne made certain inquiries last week. I have already wired the territorial office. There will be some questions for all three of you in town. Mr. Boddicker, Mr. Kessler, Mr. Renfrew, thank you. You may lower your weapons." The two hard-faced men did exactly what Marshall Holloway told them to do. They were not, as Mabel later understood, particularly brave men. They were men who had been hired for a price and had calculated in a single rapid moment that the price was no longer worth the work. Pike stood in the middle of her yard with no wagon to lean on and no men to back him up and no smile finally on his face. She walked off the porch. She walked across the yard until she was 3 feet from him. She did not raise her voice. "I owe the bank $250 today," she said. "I have it." She held out a leather pouch. He took it with hands that had begun to shake. The money in the pouch had come from many places. It had come from August Renfrew, who had bought 2 of her steers in January at a fair price because his own herd had been hit. It had come from Gerhardt Kessler, who had sent a folded packet of bills home with Tobias the week before with a note that said only for 2 of the calves and a small payment toward a debt I have not yet been able to name. It had come from Dr. Whitcomb, who had pressed $50 into her hand at her kitchen table and had refused to call it a loan. It had come from Cyrus Boddicker, who had worked 10 straight days cutting and stacking firewood she would sell to the schoolhouse in town. None of them had asked for receipts. Pike counted it. He wrote out the paid in full mark on the note. His pen scratched twice against the paper, and the second scratch went a little crooked because his hand was not steady. He left. Marshal Holloway rode off with the 2 hard-faced men. Pike's wagon followed with Pike alone in it. None of them looked back. That night, the 4 of them sat around her kitchen table. Mabel Gerhardt Kessler, August Renfrew Cyrus Boddicker. She poured whiskey for the 3 men, 2 fingers each, into the small tumblers that had been Silas's, and she poured herself coffee because she did not drink. They did not speak for a long minute. Then Gerhard Kessler raised his glass. For the woman, he said in his careful Ruhr-accented English, who would not sell the ground. The other 2 men raised their glasses. They drank. That was all that was said. Reverend Josiah Crane came to the homestead alone on horseback on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of March. He did not bring a Bible. He did not bring anything in his hands. He dismounted at her gate and he walked up the wagon track on foot, and he stood at her porch and he asked very quietly if he might speak with her for a few minutes. She let him in. She poured him a cup of coffee. He sat at her table and he could not for a long time look at her directly. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I let myself be used. I would like to tell you that I did not know what I was doing. I cannot tell you that. I knew. I did not want to know how much I knew, but I knew. The bank wanted you off this place and I provided the cover from the pulpit. I have been telling myself for 6 months that I was warning my flock against pride. I have come here today to tell you that what I was actually doing was helping a man take a widow's home." She let him speak. She did not interrupt. "I have come to ask you one question," he said. "Yes." "Do you want me to resign my pulpit? If you say yes, I will write the letter tonight. The choice belongs to you. Whatever you say, I will do." She looked at him. She had thought she would feel something hot when he asked. She did not. She felt something steadier than that. She felt in a way she could not have described to herself that she was now the kind of woman to whom men brought their resignations. "Reverend," she said, "I do not want your resignation. I want you to do your job better. There are 7 widows in this congregation that I know of by name. I am one of them. You have not visited any of us since the first month after our husbands died. I want you to start. I want you to go to each one of them before the next winter comes. I want you to ask them what they need, and I want you to remember the answer." He sat very still. "I will do that," he said. "You will." "I will." She poured him more coffee. He drank it. He stood up to leave. At the door he stopped and he turned and he said, "Mrs. Thorne, if you ever do come back to the church, you will find a different sermon waiting for you." "I might," she said. That summer, 4 families along that stretch of the high plains began digging. August Renfrew started in the 2nd week of July. Mabel walked over to his place most evenings after supper and sat on his porch with him and Ottilie and worked out together the small differences between her room and what his would need to be, because his barn was laid out differently and he had more head of stock to think about. Cyrus Boddicker did much of the heavy digging at the Renfrew place and at 2 other places that summer, swinging the pickaxe like a man working out something he could not have put into words. He slept in Mabel's barn through the spring and into the summer, and by July she had begun quietly paying him a small wage. Gerhard Kessler dug the deepest of all of them. He had the help of Tobias and of 2 hired men through August and September. When the work was finished, he sent word down to Mabel that she should come see it. She rode up to his place on a warm, late September afternoon. He took her down through the trap door in his own barn floor, and he showed her his room. The walls were smoother than hers, the floor more carefully graded. He had built drainage channels not just at the base of the north wall, but at the base of all four walls. He had set the channels with flat field stones laid in a way that water would carry the silt forward toward a small sump in the southwest corner, where a clay pipe led the water out and down the slope. He had used a ventilation system that ran through two openings instead of one, and the openings were placed so that even a still day moved air through the room without any flap having to be opened by hand. He showed her all of this without giving her any speech about it. He pointed, he nodded, he let her look. When she had been down there for almost an hour, slowly walking the perimeter, kneeling at the corners, running her gloved hand along the dressed stones of the drainage course, she stood up and looked at him. "Will you help me rebuild mine in the spring?" she said. "I thought you would ask," he said. He poured her a small glass of his own brandy when they came back up into the kitchen. They sat on his porch in the warm autumn evening. They watched the light go off the ridge to the east. After a long quiet, Gerhardt said her name. "Mrs. Thorne, Mabel," she said. "After this winter passed, I think you can use my given name. Mabel, there is a thing I have wanted to tell you. I should have told you in February. I did not know how." She waited. In the winter of '76, Gerhardt said slowly in his careful English, "There was a blizzard like the one this past February. Worse even. I was alone here with my wife Anna and our son. The boy was 10 then. Anna had been sick with a chest cold for 2 days. I went into Hollow Creek for medicine. The storm came down off the ridge faster than anyone said it would. I did not get back for 2.5 days. When I got back to my house, Anna was sitting at the kitchen table in her chair with her shawl around her and our family Bible open in her lap and her eyes closed. The fire in the kitchen stove had gone out. She had run out of wood. The boy had been asleep under her shawl against her body, and the boy was alive. Anna was not. He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I have not told anyone the part about the Bible," he said, "not even Tobias." She did not say anything. She put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand on his. "I swore to myself," he said after that winter, "that I would not see another woman die in that way out here. Not in this country, not if I could put my body between her and the cold. When you started digging your room, I thought you were perhaps grief mad. I rode out to look at you. I saw your face. You were not grief mad. You were what Anna had been. Stubborn, right. So I waited and I watched. And when the storm came, I sent my son." That was the second time in the kitchen of Gerhard Kessler that Mabel Thorne sat with another person's grief in her hand and did not let go of it. The years went the way the years go on a working homestead. Hattie grew up. She was 16 in the spring of 1893. She rode out to the McGrath Ranch one Saturday to help her mother deliver a difficult calf, and she met at the gate a tall, narrow-shouldered young sheep herder named Calvin Holbrook, who had recently come down from a place near the Wind River country. They married 3 years later. They settled 30 miles to the north on a piece of ground that had a small year-round creek through the south pasture. The first thing Hattie did the first summer after the house was finished was begin digging. Owen grew up. He went to school in Hollow Creek through 1896, and after that he apprenticed himself to a blacksmith in Cheyenne. He had his own shop by the time he was 24. He came home one weekend in every month and helped his mother with whatever needed doing. He never missed. Cyrus Boddicker worked for the Thorne place for 16 years, and when he was 50, he came into his mother's house one evening, and Mabel handed him the deed to 20 acres of the southern flat signed over and told him that he had earned it twice over and that she had only been waiting until he believed her. Mabel Thorne died in the late winter of 1908 at the age of 54 of a pneumonia that took her in 5 days. She was buried beside Silas on the small rise above the homestead. In the summer of 1909, Owen Thorne, who was then 30 years old, came back to the homestead for the last time before the place was sold to a larger ranching operation out of Laramie. He walked up the rise above the house. He pushed open the side door of the old silo. He climbed down into the room. The room was empty. The stove had been taken out years before. The bench was still there along the east wall. The lantern shelf was still there. The trapdoor pulleys hung from the ceiling, the rope frayed gray with age. He stood in the center of the room and he turned in a slow circle. He knelt and picked up a small splinter of oak from the base of the north wall. It had been knocked loose from one of the original braces, the ones his mother had set in place with planking that a German rancher had told her without ever saying why to use. He turned the splinter in his hand. He was 9 years old when he had helped her brace this wall. He was 30 now. He had buried her in February. He held the small piece of oak up to the lantern light, and he closed his hand around it, and he put it into his coat pocket. She had never written a book. She had never preached a sermon. She had never spoken before any town council. She had only paid attention to what the country was telling her, and she had followed the observation through a season of ridicule and a season of doubt and a season of men who had come to her gate with hired guns. She had dug a room beneath an old grain silo, and 4 families along that stretch of the high plains had lived through the worst winter in a decade in conditions that were bearable rather than desperate. And a small girl who had been burning with fever in February of 1889 had grown up to be a school teacher in Cheyenne, and a half-frozen calf had grown into a milking cow that had fed 2 generations of Thorne children, and a man who had once meant to burn down everything she had built had become instead the keeper of her south pasture. That kind of knowledge does not expire. That kind of woman does not expire either. Owen Thorne climbed up out of the room. He pulled the trapdoor closed behind him. He walked down off the rise in the warm summer evening with a splinter of oak in his pocket and the luscious shadow of the old silo falling away to the east behind him, and he did not look back because he did not need to. The earth held what the earth had been asked to hold. The people held what they had been asked to hold. That was enough. That had always been enough.